Welcome to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. My name is Ernie Lawrence. Today we'll be studying Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23 is some various laws given, some of them to the military when they're out and about, some of them about people who could become part of the congregation, that what they call here the congregation. They're actually talking about the nation in terms of proselytizing and becoming part of the children of Israel as a nation. So let's go ahead and get into that, and we'll decompress those as we get into them. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 1: He that is wounded in the stones or has his privy members cut off shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah. So this is talking about the private parts. If a man is cut off, if he's injured there, he does not get to come in particularly into the tabernacle or temple area to worship. And the reason for this, the connection here is that the genealogy, the reproduction of the people of Israel. Remember, God is preserving a nation through generations as descendants of Abraham. It's very, very important, the idea of descent. And so their ultimate goal is to survive as a nation until the coming of the Messiah. While a person who has been wounded there, or who has suffered a loss in that area, is unable to reproduce. And so the teaching here is that this person is unable to contribute to the ongoing survival of the nation, and because of that, they are not allowed to go into the congregation, the gathering at the tabernacle and later the temple to worship. And for that extent, they are not considered. It's kind of difficult. If they're Israelites, they're Israelites, but they don't get to participate in the ongoing purpose of what Israel is there for. And so this is why they're cut off. This isn't to be mean, but this is to teach. This is God's way of saying, understand what your purpose is. Your purpose is to bring from Abraham and through his lineage the seed, the Messiah, that would save the world. And so that's what the lesson here is. It's not supposed to be cruel or mean or whatever. And then some of these other things are about purity as well, about the purpose of bringing Messiah into the world through the Israelite nation and not through any other nation, because Israel is God's chosen nation. So we're going to see some of these things here. It says, a bastard shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah, even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of Jehovah. So somebody who is born out of wedlock, who is born out of not marriage, that person and all of their descendants for 10 generations, they're not allowed as part of the worship congregation of Israel. They're not part of the true nation. And the reason for that, again, is this idea of purity, where think about a glass full of oil, and maybe it's half full of oil and water, and it takes a while. If you keep pouring it in the water, eventually the oil will be displaced and be out of there, but it takes a while to get all the oil out of the cup by pouring water into it. And so that's what this is. This is talking about here is a person who is born outside of wedlock. Typically the word bastard is an older word. It's been turned into kind of a curse word or a slur, but it's one that means one who is born outside of wedlock, particularly one that doesn't have a father. And so that person, through no fault of their own, is in that situation, and they may go on to marry and have their own children, and then generations down the line. But to teach about purity, God says that such a person is not allowed, and their descendants are not allowed to enter into the congregation. The idea of going into the the grounds where the tabernacle and later the temple are, and participate as a full Israelite for that time period, for that many generations. Same thing with the Ammonites and the Moabites. These are the children of Lot, the descendants of Lot. It says, verse 3, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of Jehovah forever. And again, we see that word forever there. The idea of forever, of course, is lending itself to the idea of for the time period designated. That forever ended, of course, at the cross, just like most of the forevers that we're talking about. It's for the contract period, really, is the way to say that. But Ammonites and Moabites, if they marry into the Israelite nation for whatever reason, then there is their children for 10 generations because, again, of that purity. If their child marries an Israelite, and that child marries an Israelite, and that child, and their child marries an Israelite down for 10 generations, eventually after 10 generations, you have the purity there of Israelite nation restored, or the Gen X restored, to where all of the non-Israel is considered removed from the genealogy. And we see this with Ruth and David. Ruth was an ancestor of David, and she was not an Israelite. And she marries Boaz in the book of Ruth, and then 10 generations later, David is born, and Jesse was not allowed to go into the tabernacle or the temple because of that. He was the last generation that was not allowed to. And so David talks about that in the Psalms, that he counted it joy when they said, come up, let's go to worship God at the tabernacle, because he was the first generation that was allowed to do that. So a little bit of connection there. And then it says, why are the Ammonites and the Moabites not allowed? Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way when you came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. So goes back into the book of Numbers, and we can read what the Moabites and the Ammonites did. Remember, the Israelites were coming up from the south, and they were like, hey, can we pass through? We're not going to go to one side or the other, and if somebody happens to take something, we'll pay for it. And the Ammonites and the Moabites said, no, you cannot come through our land. And they put their armies at the border. They didn't attack, but they put their armies at the border to ensure that the Israelites did not come through their land as they were passing through. And so God says, all right, for that reason, then the Ammonites and the Moabites, the descendants of Lot, will not have the part that they could have had as being part of the Israelites. Remember, this is the blood of Abraham, his family, that we're talking about here. And also because of them hiring Balaam and that whole story, which you can go back and see the videos on that, or you can go back and read that for yourself in the book of Numbers. Anyway, it says in verse 5, nevertheless, Jehovah your God would not hearken unto Balaam, but Jehovah your God turned the curse into a blessing unto you, because Jehovah your God loved you. Remember, Balaam was asked 3 times to curse Israel as they moved through, and Balaam, who was a prophet of God, but not of Israel. Note that again, we see the idea of people outside of Israel still worshipped God. They knew who God was. We know Jethro, the Midianites. We know Balaam. Other people were worshiping Jehovah God, not just the Israelites. But the story of the Bible focuses on Israel now, because it's through Israel that Messiah will come. God did not forget about all the other nations. God sent Israel, or selected Israel out of the world specifically to be a blessing to the whole world. But Balaam was a servant of God, and he was known for predicting accurately. He was known for if he blessed somebody, it was actually God blessing that person. If he cursed somebody, it was actually God cursing them. And so the Ammonites and the Moabites brought Balaam up and said, hey, you need to curse these people. They're a flood. They're, what we estimate over 2 million people coming through this land, and we need you to curse them so that they don't come in and take us over. And Balaam says, well, I can only say what God tells me to say. That was his reputation. And so 3 times he was asked to curse, 3 times Balaam blessed. But then Balaam, of course, said, if you really want to get in there, I can't do anything about it. But if you really want to get in there, you need to seduce them into worshiping other gods, and this is how you do it. And I believe that was around Numbers 24 where all that took place. So anyway, you can go read about that. But God says, I would not allow Balaam to curse you. I turned that curse into a blessing because I loved you. And so he says, you shall not seek their peace nor their prosperity all your days forever. So Ammon and Moab were kind of on their own. Israel was not to be military allies with them. Somebody attacked them. Israel was like, you're on your own. You didn't help us. God does not allow us to help you because of the choice that you made. And so there was reasoning there, and it was an ongoing reason. It says forever. Again, this was for the existence, the 1,500 years that the Israelite nation existed. They were not allowed to help, as a reminder, because after generations pass, humans tend to forget things. And so when God has put this into the law, it helped them to remember, and it was a kind of a lesson to the surrounding nations. Hey, look what happened to these nations that went against Israel. It's now codified in their law, and Israel cannot help Ammon and Moab because of the choices they made. How are you going to act? Are you going to act ill towards Israel and then have it codified in their law that Israel is not allowed to help you because God told them, hey, that nation didn't help you, you are now not allowed to help them? Or are you going to be kind to Israel and become allies with Israel and be blessed by Israel? And that's essentially what the lesson is here. So for 10 generations, if you are descended from somebody who was a proselyte who married into Israel as an Ammonite or a Moabite, for 10 generations, you are not allowed to be in the tabernacle area, later the temple area. But listen to what happens here. This is a different thing, and this was kind of new to me. I hadn't heard this specific thing, again, because growing up, I didn't really have any detailed look at the Old Testament. And so I thought this was true. I thought the 10 generation rule applied to everybody, but it doesn't. Listen to this. Verse 7, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were a stranger in his land. So think about this. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau, and Esau was the brother of Jacob, who became Israel. So the Edomites are even closer kin than the Ammonites and the Moabites. They're several generations closer to each other by blood. And so God says, you're not going to abhor him. And then it says, the children that are begotten of them shall enter into the congregation of the Lord in their third generation. And that was new to me as I was studying through this. It never clicked before. I know I'd read through this a couple of times, but it just kind of, without doing this kind of study where you're really trying to understand it so that you can kind of convey that information to other people, you kind of gloss over these kind of details. And so I've read this a number of times, but it just never stuck with me. But now, Edomites and Egyptians, think about that for just a second. Edomites and Egyptians got better treatment than the Moabites and the Ammonites. And the Edomites, because they were close kin in terms of Jacob and Esau. Remember, Romans chapter 9, God tells Paul to write that Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. He's talking about the nations. They're not the individual people. Obviously, if you know anything about the Bible and the Old Testament history, you know that Paul is writing about the nations and not the people. But the Edomites were cared for, and that word hate is a word that's used because of its, we speak in hyperbole. We speak in words where I really hate asparagus. I don't actually. I like asparagus, but I really hate asparagus. Well, you don't hate it. It's just an inanimate object. But you're using a word that is extreme to convey your strong dislike. God is saying that he favored Jacob over Esau in terms of the nations that sprang from them, to an extent that it was as if God hated Esau and his descendants. And that's not actually the case. God didn't actually hate them. And the people like the Calvinists who try to go to that passage and try to teach this idea of pre-selection at the beginning of time, that God loves some people and hates others in a literal sense, is a complete and gross misuse of that passage. God did not actually hate Esau. He did not actually hate the Edomites that came from Esau at all. He actually loved them, and you can see that love here. He just did not bless them the way that he blessed Jacob and Jacob's descendants. And so the Edomites get to come into the tabernacle area and worship as descendants because they are close kin. But look at this. The Egyptians also are allowed in the third generation. And they are not very closely related at all. We don't have any actual biblical connection blood-wise going back until we get to Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In fact, the Egyptians are descended from Ham, and the Israelites are descended from Shem. So the actual blood connection goes all the way back to Noah. But the Egyptians are allowed into the third generation because you were a stranger in his land. And I see here that God is remembering the good that Egypt did, not the bad. You have the second Pharaoh that came after Joseph had passed away, that became the slave master and treated Israel bad and all of that. That's true, that happened, and justice was delivered to them because of that. But think back to Potiphar, who treated Joseph well. And think back to the Pharaoh that was friends with Joseph and made him second in all the land. And through Joseph preserved Israel, Jacob, the man Jacob, and his descendants. Think of the good that Egypt did. And I think God is remembering here, not that God forgets anything, but God is helping Israel to remember the good that Egypt did in preserving them through those 7 years of famine, through the preservation of Joseph, and all of the good things that Egypt did for them. So they get a blessing and only having to wait to the third generation here. And again, these aren't because God is being mean. It's because God is showing, hey, if you do good to Israel, if you do good to my chosen people, there is blessing in that. And if you don't, if you make the choice not to bless my people or to do well with my people, then you suffer from that one way or another. And it's by their own choice. Okay? Now, we're going to shift gears here. Excuse me. It says, when the host goes forth against your enemies, and keep them from every wicked thing. So if you're going out to fight a nation, then your soldiers need to be very pure. Now, keep in mind here that during this time period, and for most of history, when you had an army of some kind move into a foreign territory to take it, they did awful things to the people that they found there. They would do all manner of just horrible things. But God says, when you go to war against a foreign nation, you keep your men in check. They are not to do wicked things. And we've covered a lot of the things that God did not want the people of Israel doing, especially the men of Israel. And so God says, keep them from every wicked thing. And then he gives them a few, like, simple, what we would think is common sense kind of things. If there be any of you that's not clean by reason of uncleanness, that chances him by night, then shall he go abroad out of the camp, and shall not come within the camp. So there's a number of reasons they can become unclean. We've covered those extensively. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy has talked about what happens to make you unclean. If it happens by chance, in the middle of the night, then he should go out of the camp and stay out of the camp, to keep the camp of the army pure. But it shall be, when even comes on, he shall wash himself with water, and when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. So he goes through, he's out in the field. These guys are out militarily. They can't get back and make their sacrifices or whatever. It is sufficient while you're out with the army to wash yourself with water, and then you can come back in to the camp and continue on with the campaign. You shall have a place also without the camp, where you shall go forth abroad, and you shall have a paddle upon your weapon. And it shall be, when you will ease yourself abroad, you shall dig therewith, and shall turn back and cover that which comes from thee. It is very clear to us today about sanitation. It is absolutely clear the importance of sanitation. We have full infrastructures in our city for it. We've got plumbing, we got all kinds of things that go on. It took a while for mankind to learn the connection between sanitation. Going to the bathroom just anywhere in the camp was fairly commonplace. But God, knowing design, knowing infection and disease and all of those things, because he's the omniscient creator, says, hey, if you've got an army, they don't need to go potty in the middle of the camp. They need to go outside the camp, dig a hole. They got a paddle, what we would call a shovel, kind of like a flat shovel. Dig a hole, and you go to the bathroom in the hole, and then you cover it up. That's sanitation. Very basic idea to us today, but for these guys back then, they didn't understand the connection. Probably didn't like the stink of it too much in their cities or whatever, and so they would do something to get rid of it. But these guys, not very forward thinking in their technology. So this is God just giving them some simple sanitation, prevented disease, it made the army healthier. Can you imagine the other people that they were fighting who didn't have this kind of thing? The sickness and whatever natural things they would have to endure, because they did not have God saying, hey, common sense, why don't you do this thing and protect yourself from disease. So anyway, just a little bit of military sanitation there, right in the midst of all this other stuff. Okay, but he continues on. He says, for Jehovah your God walks in the middle of your camp to deliver you and to give up your enemies before you. Therefore shall your camp be holy, that he see no unclean thing in thee, and turn away from thee. So God's saying, hey, sanitation, really it's for their health, but God is saying, hey, I'm in the midst of this camp. I'm the one that's bringing you to war, and I'm the one that's going to bring you victory. So he's reminding them of his presence among them and the holiness that he calls for them to have. And so this is a part of that purity, or the physical purity that they were to maintain, again, as a teaching point about what God requires in terms of purity. And there's an interesting thing here in terms of the mindset. When you think about this idea of purity, and we've talked about this before, but when you think about this idea of purity, the level of purity that God demands of these people on a day-to-day basis is pretty strict. But God doesn't command things that man can't do. Yes, he did give them ways out, the washing with water, the sacrifice of the animals. But what does God say? Obedience is more important than sacrifice. God said, live this way and be holy. And people will say, well, it was too hard. It was impossible for them to live as holy as God wanted them to live. And then Jesus comes along and says, no, it's not. Let me show you. And he lives his entire life pure and holy. Never once does he violate any of the law. Never once is he unclean. And so these things that God is commanding them to do to maintain their holiness were things they could have done their entire lives. They could have chosen at every point to do that. We live under an easier system. The New Testament system is a much easier system in terms of both living holy, and also in terms of gaining true forgiveness, something they could not get under the Old Testament, because the blood of bulls and goats can't forgive sin. The blood of Christ can. So we have a much easier time. And so if they could have lived a holy and pure life as Jesus showed under the Old Testament, how much more can we set it as our goal to live a holy and pure and free from sin kind of life? That should be our goal, and it's not impossible. A lot of people get on to me for saying this, but it is not impossible. And even if you have sinned in the past and you have received the forgiveness that is in the blood of Christ by being immersed into Him, if you have received that so that you had your sins washed away, you can start today and set that as your goal. Go for 1 hour and don't sin. And then once you've accomplished that, go for a second, and then get to a point where you can go consciously for an entire day without sinning, and then a week, a month, a year, and make it your habit, and you'll see that eventually you can live the pure life that God is wanting you to live. It is not an impossible task to do. Okay? But anyway, this is what God calls them to do. Switching gears again. You shall not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto you. He shall dwell with you, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of your gates, where it likes him best. You shall not oppress him. So this is if they're out. Again, we're still talking in terms of foreign nations and the interactions of foreign nations and all of that. This is the overall context of this. So if somebody is a slave or a servant to a foreign nation and they escape to Israel, you don't return them, because the way that those foreign nations treat their slaves is awful. The way that Israel treats their servants is as family. Remember that. We've shown that through multiple scriptures, the way that the servants get treated by the Israelites, whether they're captured or indentured or whatever, they're to be treated like family. And so if you have somebody who escapes from another nation who is a slave and comes to you, don't return him to that nation. You let him stay there in your city and give him a place to dwell wherever he wants to live, and do not oppress him. Okay, and then it says, there shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, or sodomite of the sons of Israel. They're not allowed. The idea of the whore, of course, is talking about the women who would sell themselves for money. That kind of physical individual action is translated out to the whole nation. It's a lesson for the entire nation. God is saying, don't act like this. Don't do this. Well, what does Israel do? A lot of people will talk about the religious aspect of going after the false gods, but there was more to it. There was a huge economic side to Israel's unfaithfulness to God. They sought after the riches of other nations and they would literally subject themselves to other nations. Rome is a big example of this under the Herods, where they would subject themselves to other nations for economic reasons. Well, what is it? That's a prostitute. And so God does not allow a prostitute to continue in the context of an individual within Israel. And then a sodomite. What is a sodomite? That's a man and a man, Leviticus 18. Those are not allowed to continue. It's unnatural, and it does not serve the design of procreation. And so God says it's an abomination. Don't suffer them to live. Very simple, very plain language here. Doesn't take a scholar to sit here and decompress this and understand it. It's very straightforward. It does take a scholar to confuse the issue and try to make it say something that it doesn't say. And we got a whole bunch of those today. But it's very clear here. There shall be no either one of these. Then it says, you shall not bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog into the house of Jehovah your God for any vow, or even both of these are abomination unto Jehovah your God. So, number one, if you got your money because you were selling yourself, or You sold a dog, because dogs were considered unclean. There's a lot of talk about dogs in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 7, I believe 2 Peter talks about that. The dog returning to its vomit, those kinds of things. Dogs were gross, nasty creatures. And God says neither one of those is allowed to pay the price of the vow. Remember, there was a sacrifice that could be made for a vow that God would allow to be paid if a vow was supposed to be either canceled or was supposed to be like you couldn't keep it or whatever. But he says these are both abomination, and you're not allowed to pay those. It's ill-gotten gains, essentially, and they're unholy, they're impure, and it's kind of the same as blood money. And that's not allowed to be used for these acts of what are essentially a form of worship. Okay. Next one, and I hear this one a lot because my brother is a financial advisor. Do not lend upon usury to your brother. So the Israelites could not lend money, and that word usury there is interest. So I couldn't, if I was an Israelite, I could not lend money to another Israelite and charge interest. If I loaned him $100, he owes me back $100 eventually. He pays it, and then that's it. I cannot charge him interest. Okay. Usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury, you cannot charge interest. If you lend anything, you can't charge interest to another Israelite. Okay, they just couldn't do it. However, verse 20, unto a stranger you may lend upon usury, but unto your brother you shall not lend upon usury, that Jehovah your God may bless you in all that you settest your hand to in the land where you go to possess it. Interest, that usury is a killer. We see this with credit cards. We see this with loans. Think about getting a loan for a house. If you purchase a $100,000 home for a 30-year loan, you're going to pay over 3 times the value of that home by the time all is said and done. It's killer. Usury credit is killer. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not great with money. It is not my strong suit at all. My brother got all of the money genes. He's excellent with it. He's very knowledgeable about it. But it's not my strong suit at all. And I struggle with it, and I've been getting better with it. But I've had to learn a lot of the lessons the hard way. And one of the biggest ones is this idea of interest and what it can do when you go into debt to have to pay for things. Well, imagine what Israel would have been like if them having to charge interest to each other. What does that do to those people? And we see this today. You go to your family members and you ask to borrow money for something. Maybe you have a project or something, or you're falling on hard times or whatever. Families will lend to you to an extent, not an enabling extent, hopefully, but to an extent when you're going to work your way out of that. And so they lend you some money, and then they don't charge you interest. I think this is something that is still going on today. Most people won't charge family members or close friends interest. Yeah, you want to borrow $10? Here's $10. Just pay me back whenever, right? And we do that. We do that within the church. A lot of times you have the church will say, you need money for this or you need money for that. And a lot of times the church will say that's a gift. You don't even have to pay that back. But God does not say it's sinful to charge interest. He just understands how powerful it can be if you charge interest for those who are close to you. That it can be damaging to your relationship, that it can be a loosening of the ties that bind, that kind of thing. And so he prevents Israel from charging interest to each other. But he says you can charge it to the strangers, the people who are from other nations, people who are passing through, even the people who are proselytizing. They were allowed to be charged interest because they weren't fully Israelites. And so that's the lesson here. All right, it says, when you shall vow a vow unto Jehovah your God, you shall not slack to pay it, for Jehovah your God shall surely require it of you, and it would be a sin in thee. So if you vow, now we can go to Acts 5 and Ananias and Sapphira with this, even though that was under the New Testament. It's a interesting example of it. Ananias and Sapphira said they had sold a land for so much money and they were giving all of it, and they were lying about it. Okay, God says when you vow a vow, don't be slack in paying it. You pay it on time, you pay it the full amount, for God is going to require it of you one way or another. It will be sinful for you to not pay back the vow, the promised amount. Okay, but if you shall forbear to vow, there's no sin in you. So in other words, if you don't ever make the vow, if you don't make the contract here, that's the idea of the contract. And I think that even goes back up to this idea of the hire of a whore, the price of a dog, that kind of thing. It's into the house of Jehovah for any vow, but I think this is also in terms of for paying for contracts. Okay, so this idea of a vow here is also used in the term, the idea of a contract. Okay, so you shall, if you don't make the contract, there's no sin in not making the contract altogether. But if you make the vow to another person, you need to pay the contracted price. If somebody comes and paints my house, and I agreed to pay them $500 for that, I better pay them $500. And we see that this is one of those things that's brought forward into most modern nations, particularly in the United States. Why does government exist? It exists primarily to enforce contracts between people. Otherwise, the government should stay out of our lives. That's really the idea of the American Constitution. Is the government is limited. The government stays out of our lives. It is only there when there is a dispute between the states, a dispute between individuals that needs to be enforced, or you need to have third-party arbitration. That is the entire purpose of our government to exist. Is to do that in terms of disputes, is settling disputes, even if they're foreign disputes. A foreign dispute might take the form of war, but the government exists only to settle those disputes that we as individuals cannot. Otherwise, the government's supposed to stay out of our lives. But anyway, God says if you don't make the vow, if you don't make the contract, there's no sin in that. But it says, that which has gone out of your lips you shall keep and perform, even a free will offering, according as you have vowed unto Jehovah your God, which you have promised with your mouth. So, if you say, God, I'm going to pay this much, if you tell your brother, I'm going to pay this much, then you need to keep your word. That idea is a verbal contract. It's considered a vow, and you need to keep it. And then when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, these last two are interesting. We're switching gears again here. It says, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat grapes. Then you may eat grapes your fill at your own pleasure, but you shall not put it in a vessel. In other words, if you wander, if you're out traveling or whatever, and you get hungry and you see a vineyard down there, God says it is okay to go grab some of those grapes and eat them. Do not take some for the road. Don't put them in a container for later or whatever, because essentially at that point, God considers that stealing. But by law, they were allowed to go take what they needed to eat right then at that moment. And this is number one about God's providence, that they would always have enough to eat. That the people who owned the vineyard and later the field of corn or whatever, they were willing and saying, hey, yeah, no, go ahead. I know you're hungry. Grab a bite to eat. Not a problem at all. And so this is allowed by law. And I think this actually serves into later when we see David and his friends when they're fleeing from Saul. There's a point in time where they're hungry, and they're allowed to take some food that is available to them. I believe it was the showbread in the temple, or not the temple, the tabernacle. And this isn't a violation of law. This is an application of this part of the law. Later on, you have the disciples who were wandering through a field following Christ as he's out preaching or whatever, and they're doing this. they're following this law. They're allowed to take parts of it. They're like, oh, they're violating the Sabbath. And Jesus says, no, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. This is, they're hungry. This part, this little thing is allowable by the law. So it's not a breaking of the law. It's an applying of a different part of the law, that when you're hungry, God provides, you are allowed to eat. God's not going to cause you to starve just because of the circumstances in your situation make it to where it's difficult for you to otherwise get food. So when you come to your neighbor's vineyard, or when you come into the standing corn of your neighbor, then you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not move a sickle into your neighbor's standing corn. So you can go in, and if you're hungry, grab a bite to eat, but you may not take any for the road. You can't steal from them. It's not considered stealing. It's considered stealing if you take it for later. But if you take it and eat it right then and there, it's not. And I'll give you a kind of a modern example of this. I know that Coca-Cola had a commercial up in movie theaters a few years ago. I don't know if they still use it, where they said that sip stealing is encouraged. And the idea is, and I do this when I go in to places where they have tea. I'll pour just a tiny bit of the tea into a cup, and I'll drink it, because sometimes if the tea's been there a while, it goes bad. I don't want to buy that. But you go in and you take a little sip or whatever, and if it's bad or whatever, you don't buy that. I think that is perfectly fine. I don't think that's stealing, and I think it kind of fits into here, although it's not necessarily about hunger. But I think there's that little bit of leeway there when you're maybe testing the healthiness of a food, or the is it expired, or those kinds of things. I think it's perfectly fine. I don't think you're stealing at all at that point. And I know the people where I go, I frequent there's one racetrack here in Clarksville. I know most of the people that work there, because I go there almost every day during the school year in the morning to get tea for the day. And so those people know me, I know them, and we've had this conversation. Is it okay? And yeah, that's fine. Nobody cares. It's not stealing at all. And so God is saying, hey, in law, it's codified. It's not stealing. If you just get enough to feed you right then and there, it's fine. And it's not considered stealing. But don't put it in a vessel, and don't bring a sickle and start harvesting corn from somebody else's crops, because then it's stealing. So anyway, that is Deuteronomy chapter 23. A little bit easier than 22. A lot less controversial stuff for the most part. There was a couple of lines in there, but I think they were pretty straightforward. But thank you again for joining me. I look forward to your questions and conversation. And again, my name is Arnie Lawrence, and this has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation. And we'll see you next time.